Let's talk about free agency for the Pacers. Specifically, we're going to go by position, break down what the Pacers might want in free agency at a certain position, what targets are the best at that position, who actually makes sense for the blue and gold at each position. Today, we'll start with point guards on the Locked On Pacers podcast.
You are Locked On Pacers, your daily Indiana Pacers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome in to another edition of the Locked On Pacers podcast, where we, of course, talk about the Indiana Pacers. As always, my name is Tony East. I cover the team for Forbes and the Westside Community News. And today, we're going to do one of my favorite series to do in the offseason, free agency previews by position for the Pacers. So I go through every position: point guard, shooting guard, small forward, power forward, center, using Spotrac's positional designations, look at every free agent who could be on the market and see, okay, what makes sense for the Pacers. And so I think the best way to do these shows, and how I've done them for the last 5 seasons now, is identifying why the Pacers might want to sign a guy at that position and how much resources they would like to put into it. So, for example, we're doing point guards today, and the Pacers might not want to invest a ton in point guard. And we'll talk about why in a second. And then look at the best targets. If the Pacers go splashy at point guard, even ignoring that they may not want to use a bunch of resources there, who are the best guys on the market? And then talking about, given the Pacers situation, realistic targets at that position. I think it's a good way to contextualize who the Pacers might pursue when this all comes up. And I think when Adam and I were co-hosting the show for years, we got Tyreke Evans right, we got Malcolm Brogdon right, we got Jeremy Lamb targeted as a guy the Pacers could go after. I think we said Kyle O'Quinn. We often get really close when you kind of parse all through this stuff. So I find these to be very helpful previews. And today we'll do point guards. So what makes the point guard position so interesting for the Pacers to me in free agency is that there's kind of a lot in flux. Because if you zoom out, it's very easy to say they should not use many resources on this position. Tyrese Halliburton's on the team as of right now. Malcolm Brogdon's on the team as of right now. TJ McConnell is on the team as of right now. Dwayne Washington brought the ball up every so often last season. Right? It's not like they really need somebody at this spot. They flexed Duarte there every so often last year. All these guys are back for the Pacers. That said, who knows what TJ McConnell's future holds? If Brogdon is back, TJ McConnell might not play very much. And Brogdon, who knows what his future holds? One of the most popular trade candidates amongst people who have been discussing what the Pacers might do this summer. Right? Not to say the Pacers are necessarily considering that or not, but given that Tyrese Halliburton is the guy who's having the keys, he also plays point guard. Even if they deal nobody and they play Brogdon at the 2 and McConnell's your backup or whatever, even if Hallie's your guy, you only have about 12 to 15 backup point guard minutes available if you play Brogdon full time at the 2. So given the Pacers roster spots or construction right now, point guard might not be something they consider strongly. That said, I don't think they should totally ignore it. In fact, I think they should probably pursue some depth piece at this position. And I always think teams should have extra depth at point guard, and here's why. Right? Last year, for example, this is not even counting Lance Stevenson. We'll mention him in a second. 54 games played combined between Kiefer Sykes, Brad Wanamaker, and Gabe York. And none of those three guys were ever overlapping on the team, right? Wanamaker was opening night through Christmas. Sykes was Christmas through the last 5 days or whatever of the season. And then Gabe York was those last 5 days. Those guys were the emergency, air quotes, point guards. And the Pacers, especially if Brogdon is back, have for some frail guys at that spot. Injuries can pop up everywhere, right? Those guys were playing almost every day. And when they weren't playing, the guy who filled in their stead, as those three cycled as the emergency point guard, the guy who filled in was Lance Stevenson. And Lance also played a bunch of games for the Pacers last season. He finished the season at 40 games played for the Pacers. Remarkably, Lance, who was signed after New Year's, finished 9th on the Pacers in games played, which is crazy, right? So even though Halliburton should be back next year, Brogdon could be back and recovering from health, and McConnell's finally healthy again, and Dwayne Washington can play the point, and they have some draft picks available to maybe draft another guard. And Duarte maybe, and Buddy Hield's still there. Like, all these things say they're pretty set at guard, and yet I still think they probably need one more fringy guy given their current roster situation, right? And maybe that is a Lance Stevenson. Maybe that's another young guy who's kind of unproven. Maybe that's a really established vet who can be a good locker room presence. But either way, that kind of makes sense to me as strong resource allocation for the Pacers is not a lot of like maybe you give money to a guy at point guard if he can play a bunch of other positions. And there's one guy in particular, I mentioned his name on a podcast a few weeks ago, that makes a lot of sense given, again, Spotrac's positional designations. If they're not on that list, they'll be on a different show, I promise. I think there's one guy in particular on this list that stands out as a guy you'd give maybe a little bit more resource to. But in general, I don't think, given the Pacers' current roster situation, they need to invest a lot in a point guard unless they can play a bunch of positions. But the other factor at play here is Malcolm Brogdon's future with the team isn't perfectly clear. TJ McConnell's future with the Pacers is not perfectly clear. The roles of every player, even, none of these guys have all played together. It was so much in and out of the lineup stuff last year. Even if they were healthy, who knows how the Rick Carlisle and the Pacers view these guys in terms of what the rotation should look like. So it's really hard to say, one, if they feel like they need a point guard or not, and two, let's say they trade Brogdon, which is totally plausible in the current landscape of the Pacers, and they determine McConnell's not the backup they need anymore, and they don't draft a guard. All of a sudden, they have a big need there. None of those things are crazy outcomes this offseason at all. Brogdon and McConnell are kind of outside the Pacers' target age range of what makes sense right now. Both of, especially in McConnell's case, because he's locked in as a point guard, right? Maybe he could play a few minutes per game with Halliburton, but it's going to be hard to play him a lot if you're playing Halliburton and Brogdon as much as you want. Like, there's not a lot out there for those guys, and perhaps the Pacers could be looking to move them. And so if that happens, all of a sudden this conversation changes, drastically. Drastically. Because, if you trade Brogdon and McConnell, all of a sudden your backup point guard is nothing. It's basically nobody. Maybe Dwayne Washington a little bit, but I wouldn't be ready to go there if I'm the Pacers. So then you probably like to put a decent amount of money in there, especially if you can get a guy who can play multiple positions, or a guy who can be more flexible for you, or a guy who you're comfortable. If Halliburton gets hurt, they become the starter, right? And if you trade both of them, then all of a sudden you need that backup I just described and the depth piece we were talking about at the beginning. So, when we talk about shooting guards later this week, and I like to have guests for these, but point guard's the most boring one of these, just given the Pacers' current roster. Like Duarte, you can say is the two, or is a two, and Dwayne Washington and Buddy Hield. Like they could trade Buddy, but like more established in general guys square up at the two. Like, it's less likely they trade multiple of them heading into next season. Whereas with point guard, a lot of them could be dealt and put it in a lot of flux. So like with shooting guard, it's a little more straightforward. There's not as much need for positional moving aroundness and things like that with trades. But with point guard, this is all very much in flux. And that's why this position, as of right now, seems like one the Pacers shouldn't put a lot of resources into, but could be one that they identify as, oh, wow, we really need a backup one, especially if Halliburton gets hurt or something like that. Whereas at the two, even if they get rid of Buddy, they'd have Duarte and Dwayne Washington, and they could move other guys up to the two that they already have on the team. So I think in general, when you think about point guard, the moves they make before free agency will kind of dictate what their need is. But the final factor is the draft. Let's say they trade one of Brogdon and McConnell, but then they draft Mike Ivey, or they draft Dyson Daniels or something like that. And Dyson Daniels is not a point guard, but he is a guard, and that would create more of a logjam there. I guess Dyson Daniels is a wing, but there's not a lot of guards at the top of the draft, so I was just naming more names. Anyway, if they end up with a guard, or maybe they get a guard later in the draft, even in the draft, that again changes your calculus. Shaedon Sharpe, for example, you could call a guard for sure. Ty Washington, if they end up somehow with the pick and like just outside the lottery or in the 20s or something, right? Maybe that ends up happening. And if they draft a guard, then their needs change again. So this position, obviously the draft, that will be true for every position. If they draft a guy at that position, their free agency needs change. But I think with point guard, and the main reason point guard is the most straightforward free agency position, is even if they trade Brogdon and McConnell, the best they need is a backup, right? The best, because Halliburton is the guy for this team. And Duarte is probably a guy they'll keep around, so you could probably say the same about, the wing or wherever position you box him in, 2 or 3. But, even more so with Halliburton. He's the guy, right? So at the most, the Pacers would be pursuing a backup. Like, it's plausible that Turner gets traded and they pursue a starting center. They need more wings like crazy at the 3 and the 4. Duarte can play 2 or 3, so you could sign a stud at either position and just move him to the other. But at point guard, it's set. It's Tyrese Halliburton. Regardless of all the other moving parts that I've just described that could complicate things. So while there could be a way that the Pacers need to put more money into the position than just like a minimum or something, it's not likely that they need someone better than a backup level guy, unless Halliburton's moving off the ball, which seems like a terrible, terrible way to use their new star player they acquired at the trade deadline. So who are the best point guards on the market this summer? Do any of them actually make sense for the Pacers? And given what I just said, probably not, but there's one guy, maybe two, that are worth talking about a little bit, again, using Spotrac's positional designations. So let's talk about that. But really quick, before we do that, I got to talk to you guys about Sakara. Feeling your best starts with what you eat, and Sakara helps you live a healthy, balanced lifestyle and truly enjoy it with delicious, plant-rich, transformational nutrition that builds a foundation for living in your best body. Now is the time to seek wellness, joy, and abundance in all areas of your life, starting with what you eat. With Sakara, you get nutrient-dense meals, snacks, and supplements that nourish your body without ever sacrificing taste or quality. Sakara is a wellness company anchored in food as medicine, on a mission to nourish your body through the power of plants. They give you the tools you need to transform your life with their organic, ready-to-eat meal delivery program and wellness essentials. They have plant-rich ingredients that help you boost your energy, support digestion, and curb your cravings. So right now, Sakara is offering our listeners 20% off their first order when they go to sakara.com/lockedon20 or enter code lockedon20 at checkout. That's Sakara, SAKARA.com/lockedon20 to get 20% off your order. Sakara.com/lockedon20. Thank you, everybody, as always, for making Locked On Pacers your first listen today and every single day. As a reminder, we are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube, where you can see me and where I cut my face shaving this morning. Perfect for a video podcast. Let's talk about who the Pacers' best options on the market are at point guard this summer. Not the Pacers' best options, but around the league, the biggest names that will be discussed at this position, because there are some big names still, even in a weaker free agency class in general. Really quick, though, quick favor. We put together a survey to learn more about our listeners here at the Locked On Network. It's an opportunity to tell us and me what you like and hate about these shows. Go to lockedonpodcast.com/survey right now to get started. It won't take you very long, and you have a chance to win a $100 Ticketmaster gift card. Lockedonpodcast.com/survey. Really appreciate the help for anyone who does that. Let me know if you do on Twitter. That would be awesome. Okay, so the best options at point guard. Look, the prize name, if you're into names, is Kyrie Irving, who has a player option worth $34 million this summer. He's not coming to the Pacers. I mean, he'll probably re-sign with Brooklyn, and it's Kyrie. Weird stuff has happened. He switched teams twice already unexpectedly in his career. Maybe he does again. I do not anticipate him landing in Indiana. The other two guys who make a lot, this is crazy. There's only 4 point guards, at least per, again, Spotrac's positional listings, but only 4 point guards entering free agency this summer who made more than $10 million this past season. One is Kyrie. One is Pacer guard Ricky Rubio, who, again, people forget he's a Pacer. And then the other two are Russell Westbrook and John Wall. And the only way either of those two guys would end up on the Pacers is a trade, a salary dump, where the Pacers also get an asset. More so with Westbrook, that possibility exists than Wall to me. But you never really know what the Rockets are thinking. They sat Wall out all season last year, which totally sucked because John Wall is my favorite player in the league. It doesn't matter. Hopefully that John Wall can play this year. But anyway, that's unrelated to covering the Pacers. That those two guys, even if they opt out, would like to pursue a starting role or lots of money, and the Pacers would likely not give them both. So when you look at the best point guards in free agency this summer, Kyrie Irving, Russell Westbrook, John Wall, those aren't the best guys. Those are the biggest names, though. None of them really make sense for the Pacers, both in terms of their financial situation, if they're trying to be good or not, what makes sense for the Pacers. So there are two guys that I would like to talk about here that are very good, and I guess a little bit makes some sense for the Pacers, especially if there's a Brogdon trade in one of these cases. One of those guys is Jalen Brunson. Jalen Brunson just had a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful playoffs for the Dallas Mavericks. I mean, he has a couple rough games in later series, but really fueled them as an alpha past Utah in some key games. His final playoff stats, 22 points per game on pretty good shooting splits. Not a great passer, though. Right? You might even consider him more of an off-ball guard than an on-ball guard. Averaged less than 5 assists per game this past season, and he has Luka's dominating the ball. He can pass better than that. But his stats are awesome. 16 point per game scorer, really efficient. He's a good player. He can play off the ball, as evidenced by what he did with Luka. Now, he might want to have the ball more, which could be a reason for him liking to leave Dallas. If he does, I don't know what he's thinking necessarily. But in Indiana, Tyrese Halliburton have the ball a lot. So if the Pacers love Jalen Brunson, and I loved Jalen Brunson in the draft that he was in, by the way, if they are willing to throw him a ton of money to convince him to come to Indiana over anywhere else, That would make some sense because I think he can play off the ball and fit with Halliburton, but I think he would like the ball more than he got in Dallas. I think that'd be possible to do. But if you're the Pacers, is that really the money you want to be spending this summer? A guy that might fit with Halliburton? Now, Brunson is 25 right now. He'll turn 26 before the next season starts. So he's young and talented. That makes some sense to me. Not perfect sense, but some sense. So he is a rare exception in the best point guard category group that does make some sense, to me at least, if he ended up on the Pacers this summer. So that's one path of pursuit, and especially if a guy like Brogdon is gone, because then you can sell to Brunson. You will be running our second units. You will handle the ball with those groups. And then it might be possible to entice a guy like that to join your team. You're a scoring punch alongside our, apple of our eye young point guard, Tyrese Halliburton. And then as soon as he comes out of the game, you're the one. Here's the ball, go do your thing. Played with Carlisle before, I might add. I think that's key to note here. It was solid under Carlisle that last season he played in Dallas, but Jason Kidd obviously was the one who made him a starter, and he exploded this past season. The other guy that I think, excuse my chair there, makes a little bit of sense in this discussion for the Pacers, largely because of his age, is Collin Sexton. Collin Sexton. Now, before we talk about Collin Sexton, talk about something that's happened and has been a little under-discussed this summer. Chris Fedor, Cleveland.com, fantastic reporting about the Cleveland Cavaliers, just a few days ago reported on Sexton and said there are 5 teams with enough cap space to make an offer at Sexton and link the Pacers in the piece, and says that the Pacers could potentially be a team, link the Pacers potentially as a team of interest, although mostly just citing their cap space. He didn't say, that the Pacers are pursuing him or are planning to pursue him or anything. He just said they're a cap space team. But what did link Sexton and the Pacers is Joe Varden in The Athletic last December. And that was right after. So Fedor, again, just linked that the Pacers have cap space and Sexton is a free agent. Joe Varden last December, just a few days after that big article came out about the Pacers potentially changing directions from Shams and Bob Kravitz, he reported that the Indiana likes Collin Sexton as a terrific scorer. So there has been some linkage in the past from plugged-in reporters of Sexton and the Pacers. Now, let's talk about this. Collin Sexton is clearly a talented scorer. I think that assessment of calling him a terrific scorer is true. Like, it's kind of undersold to me. He was a 24 points per game scorer in 2020-21. And then Garland needed the ball more last year. And Sexton barely played, only 11 games. Garland needed the ball more, and so he didn't shoot nearly as much. He didn't play nearly as much. Shot attempts went down 5 per game. Sexton was a 24 points per game scorer on 48-37 splits. So, what I will say is, I think he's better suited to have the ball in his hands a lot, and that really minimizes Tyrese Halliburton. Also, Collin Sexton can effing score the basketball, man. So, his defense is really weak. He's coming off of a terrible injury. He's only 6'1". His defense is questionable at best. He's only 23 as well, fits the Pacers timeline. So I think there is an argument for pursuit here for the Pacers, but they need to get him some defensive buy-in, and I think they need to figure out exactly how to maximize him and Halliburton together, which could be pretty difficult. He's also a restricted free agent, which would make it hard because the Cavs could just match his deal. Now, I always bring this stuff up. They have Kevin Love and Larry Markkinen on big contracts right now. They'll have to pay Evan Mobley and Darius Garland not far from now. Right, they're going to be an expensive team soon. They perhaps don't want to pay Sexton, but they can deal with that in the future. That's a future Cavs problem. They might just match now and deal with it later. So it could be hard to get Sexton, but he has been linked. I don't know if he fits perfectly with Halliburton in my eyes, but he is a good enough scorer that you maybe would try to, especially at his age, again, just 23 years old, find a way to make it work. So between Brunson and Wall and Westbrook and Irving and Sexton, that is the creme de la creme of this upcoming point guard class. There are some other wily vets who playoff teams will pursue, like Rajon Rondo is going to probably be pursued, and if Corey Joseph opts out in Detroit, team seems like him. Dennis Schroeder's out there; he's at least good. Daylon Wright is good. There are quality players. DJ Augustine, the Lakers scooped him up mid-season. There are quality players, but the drop between the 5 I just named and in the next guy is enormous, humongous. And maybe Ricky Rubio's in that tier, depending on how he is viewed right now, coming off of a torn ACL, over age 30. But this is not a very strong point guard class. So barring a Brogdon trade, I don't think the Pacers pursue any of those top names I just said, but if they do, the two to keep an eye on would be Brunson, because he's a good unrestricted free agent that isn't going to make a max level deal next year like Irving, Westbrook, and Wawell. And then Colin Sexton, because there have been the prior links, Fedor talking about the Pacers cap space and Sexton being a free agent, as well as Joe Varden specifically linking the two parties. So, what is realistic here? If the Pacers keep McConnell around, or even if they just keep Halliburton around, still going to need someone in reserve. Let's talk about who makes the most sense and who I like with these resources. But first, guys, let's talk about betonline.net, your number one source for all your betting stats and sports info. You can find all the latest sports developments, news, and odds, including this year's basketball finals for the NBA, NHL hockey conference finals rolling on. I believe the Stanley Cup is starting very soon. Major League Baseball, of course, the latest fighting news, MMA, UFC, boxing, all over at betonline.net. If you're listening on Wednesday, game 3 tonight, they've got it up. Celtics favored by 3.5. Juicy home game odds there after the Warriors blew them out in game 2. Really looking forward to the next finals game. BetOnline, your continued source for all your sports wagering information, including live betting, esports, and more. Head over to that website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in the action over at betonline.net. BetOnline is where the game starts. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Pacers your first listen today and every single day. For your second listen, Locked On NBA Big Board, hear more about the draft prospects, what's going on around the league on the draft front. Big draft for the Pacers. Talked about Johnny Davis on yesterday's podcast. You won't want to miss that. And tomorrow, Mark Williams, the last center we're going to cover here for the draft. But I want to do all my lotto guys. I want to get them all covered just in case the Pacers do move back. Then I'll have my butt covered, and it's fun to dive into these guys. They could be on the Pacers in 5 years, for example. So, what is a realistic option for the Pacers here? Because those 5 guys I just really talked about, I guess you could make some arguments that those make sense, but it seems like with Halliburton on the team, resources could be better allocated elsewhere. And so the Pacers would probably like to spend not a lot on a backup point guard, either a guy who's filling in behind Halliburton or just a depth piece. Like I said, 54 games from Sykes, Wanamaker, and York. You need someone to fill that role. So one obvious choice, if they do deal some guys, is Lance Stevenson. Why not? He was a good backup point guard for this team last season. He can play the 3. Positional versatility, I think, is very valuable in this pursuit. Even if they only deal one of Brogdon or McConnell, it makes sense to bring back Lance. Even if they deal neither of them, it makes a little bit of sense to bring back Lance because fan favorite, brings the juice, good vet, and was solid at times last year with the ball. So even if he wouldn't be in the rotation or play, I don't think that he is one of the guys that makes the most sense if they're going to sign another depth piece point guard. Even if Lance is their 7th guard next year, it does make sense that he would be a guy in this role. And I kind of described this when I typed it in my notes as either someone young who has some flaws but can grow in the Pacers system, and then if they need him, they at least can try to grow someone, or like a really established cheapo vet, not like anyone in between. Like Dennis Schroeder is probably too good for what I'm talking about here. Tyus Jones, Daylon Wright, these guys, even Corey Joseph probably, are established, but they're not like cheapo established. And another thing you have to consider is it's fun to say, oh, great, the Pacers could go after a third point guard and bring in, I don't know, Campazzo or Austin Rivers or something. And okay, those would be awesome depth point guards, but the Pacers have to negotiate with this guy, and they're not going to come in and say, hey, we want you to come to our team and not play. They have to, the guy that would fit the role the best, and something that I think is so under-discussed in free agency discussions when people cover it, is the guy has to accept the role and what's going to happen in negotiations. So why I think a young guy or a really strong, older established vet makes sense is those guys would be willing to take guaranteed money and no guaranteed minutes, or any spot on a team in terms of some of the young guys. So Lance really fits that, right? He's a really older established vet, but isn't so good that he's worth extra the resources like I talked about with Schroeder and those guys who are going to want a guaranteed role. Lance might want some role, but I don't think he'd want a guaranteed role. He was out of the league for 2.5 years. Being on a team seems like the goal for him. So that is the hard part of this. Have to be either willing to not play, or to me, another factor here is if you're the Pacers and you go into this, you either say, hey, we'll give you guaranteed money, but you're not playing, or you got to be able to play a bunch of positions. And that is where my number one favorite target on this list pops up. And I don't know if I'd necessarily consider him a point guard, but he's playing in the finals right now for the Golden State Warriors, and that is Gary Payton II. Outside the Pacers' age range, certainly at age 29, but a really good defensive guard, not a terrible play finisher, can handle it, can rebound, 6'3". Even if he's only on the Pacers for like 2 years as a depth guard, he can play full positions, right? He plays 1, 2, 3, even sometimes for the Warriors, and he's got skills and he could really help teach some defense and be involved in some defense. He is the guy that makes a lot of sense to me if he's willing to accept a small role. Now, he might want a bigger role because he's in the rotation for the Golden State Warriors in the finals. But if, for example, the backup point guard spot is totally open for the Pacers, that is to me be like ideal guy. He could play next to Halliburton, no problem. He could play instead of Halliburton, no problem. Could slide him to the 2 or the 3. You don't want him to play the 3 at only 6'3", but that's totally fine to me as an option. He is to me one of the best fits in this role, as is Lance. Outside of that, there's not a ton of guys. Like Dalen Wright's really good and can play multiple positions and is a solid defender. He's also 30 and is probably going to fetch like $8 to $10 million a year. That doesn't make a lot of sense for the Pacers necessarily. So it's hard to find guys who are both in the right age range. Like, for example, Frank Jackson's only 24. He was a high second-round pick, I believe, just 2 seasons ago, maybe 3 at this point, after his season with the Pistons. If he's willing to come to the Pacers, that would be nice for the Pacers, for example. But, is he going to accept not playing? He was starting at the end of the season at times for the Pistons, played 53 games for them. He averaged over 10 points a game. That could be a solid option if there is room at backup point guard. But as of now, it doesn't look necessarily that there's a ton of space there. A guy like Carson Edwards, another one, the Purdue guy, I almost just said grad, but I don't think he graduated. The Purdue product. He also finished the season with the Detroit Pistons, finally found some footing in the NBA after bouncing around a little bit. He struggled with his shot, only shot 30% with Detroit, but has gotten back in the league. Like, are they willing to take that sort of swing? He is also only 24 years old. Maybe he's one guy that they could push for if they go the young route. Another guy that I have to bring up because of how I covered him last year in the draft, Sharife Cooper, still not even 21. Went in the second round last year to Atlanta. Maybe they make him a restricted free agent because he is coming off of his first contract with them on a 2-way. But he could be a young guy who he turns 21 in just a few days, so he's only 20 right now. But still, could be a guy that you say, this is our third point guard. Let's try to develop this dude, and maybe he can be something good for us with his skills off the dribble. So that's some of the younger guys that make a little bit of sense, like Cassius Winston, for example, who spent some time with the Wizards this season. Could be one that makes a little bit of sense. RJ Nembhard, his younger brother from Gonzaga in this draft class. Some of those younger guys could make sense, but I think the vet will be the route the Pacers go because Halliburton is already young, because they have youth in other positions. Bringing a vet in to kind of be the steady hand if you absolutely have to break the glass in case of emergency at point guard, like they did so often this past season, you get a steady hand. They had a vet in terms of age with Sykes, but he was inexperienced and struggled at times. Wanamaker was just not very good. I think they learned the quality, or at least the importance of having quality at this super depth point guard position. So Lance, again, makes a ton of sense. Like Rubio would be too good, for example. He's probably overqualified for this role entering free agency for the Pacers. Maybe Aaron Holiday, ironically. I don't know if he'd want to come back necessarily, but he could be an interesting one here. Howell Neto from the Wizards as well. He's on the wrong side of 30 now, but as a minimum guy, I like what he can bring, and I don't think he would demand a role. In fact, I don't think he wasn't playing in every game for the Wizards this past season. They were not playing him for Aaron Holiday, for a while. He played 70 games, started 19 times for the Wizards this past season. Those are the kind of targets that make the most sense to me. And a kind of steadier hand, older guy who is willing to, ride the bench but play when needed. And that's where, Lance makes a lot of sense, or some of the other guys already brought up, former Pacer DJ Augustine maybe, and his advanced age could be one. So I think on either side of the age range makes the most sense. So the realistic options change a lot if there are trades. Like if McConnell and Brogdon are gone, all of a sudden you can ratchet that up a bit and say, oh, maybe a younger guy who even is a little established would be willing to come and be the backup point guard for the Pacers. And that's when you can get into that Frank Jackson kind of conversation, who isn't necessarily, he'd be willing to take any contract with a role and kind of earn his way into something else. For example, so that their obviously their demands change if their roster changes, but I think those are the realistic targets that make the most sense to me. I think Lance obviously makes a ton of sense. Gary Payton would really elevate the Pacers, and then some of those younger guys, and Hal Neto would be good depthy point guards for the Pacers if they determine that they need somebody. And if they don't, because they have Tyrese Halliburton and TJ McConnell and Malcolm Brogdon and other guards on the team, then perhaps it's just maybe a two-way guy even. And in that case, it could be whoever they draft, like with the last pick in the draft or an undrafted free agent. Dejan Jarreau played one game for the Pacers this year as their break glass of a case of emergency point guard on a two-way deal. That's not out of the realm of possibility too. And if it's a free agent or an undrafted guy, I can't predict who that could be. That could be anybody. But in terms of actual free agents, those are the names that I think make the most sense. Let me know if you think I missed someone who makes a lot of sense in this discussion. And please check the Spo track list first if you think I didn't hit someone who you think makes a lot of sense, because there's a chance they're at a different position on that site, and then I would get to them in a future episode. For example, Lance is actually listed as a shooting guard on that site, but he's easy to use, for me at least, in this discussion. So thank you guys a ton for listening. We'll do shooting guards on Friday of this week, and I plan to have a guest for all of these except for this one, and maybe centers, because Go Guys, Ajax, and Miles Turner, that one's pretty straightforward as well. But we'll see. So it should be a guest on Friday. Tomorrow there'll be a guest breaking down Mark Williams, the center for Duke, who can almost touch the rim just by standing and reaching his arm straight in the air. We'll break it all down tomorrow. Thank you guys a ton for listening. Have a great day, and we will see you tomorrow.